The autopilot light was still glowing green. That was the detail investigators kept returning to. Not a warning, not an alarm, just a small green light, steady and calm, telling three experienced men in the cockpit that everything was under control, while the airplane quietly sank toward the Florida swamp beneath them. For 80 seconds, the aircraft held its altitude perfectly. Then almost nothing happened. A control wheel nudged by an elbow. A mode silently reassigned itself, and an airplane that had just been hailed as the most advanced airliner in the sky began a descent so gradual that human senses, tuned for danger, for sudden movement, for anything loud, simply couldn't register it. Nobody touched the controls. Nobody made a mistake in the way we usually imagine mistakes. And that's precisely why this story still unsettles engineers half a century later. To understand how this happened, you have to go back to a time when landing an airliner was one of the last truly unautomated acts left in modern travel, and to the machine built, quite deliberately, to end that. In the years before the TriStar entered service, flying was still, at its core, a physical act of faith. A pilot descending toward a socked-in runway in heavy fog was flying almost entirely on instruments, cross-checking altitude, airspeed, and heading dozens of minutes a minute, hands never leaving the controls. If the weather dropped below certain minimums, there was only one acceptable response: divert. An airport buried in fog simply closed its doors to arriving traffic, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for a full day. Passengers experienced this as maddening uncertainty, circling for an hour over a city they could see the lights of, then being told the flight was diverting 200 miles away. Airlines experienced it as lost revenue and cascading schedule chaos. And pilots experienced something harder to name: the compounding fatigue of manually flying every second of an approach where the margin for error kept shrinking as visibility kept dropping. Engineers had been chasing a solution for years, an autopilot capable of not just holding heading and altitude in cruise, which by the 1960s was already common, but of flying the entire approach and touchdown itself, in conditions where a human pilot could see nothing at all. The dream had a name long before anyone built a working version of it: Autoland. It was, on paper, a simple idea. In execution, it was one of the hardest problems in aviation. When Lockheed began designing the L-1011 in the late 1960s, they weren't just building another wide-body jet to compete with the newly arrived Boeing 747. They were building an airplane that treated automated landing not as an accessory, but as a foundational design goal. The engineering challenge was trust. Mechanical trust, redundant and self-checking, because asking a pilot to release control entirely during the most dangerous phase of flight meant the system had to be more reliable than the pilot himself. Lockheed's answer was to triplicate everything that mattered. Instead of one autopilot computer feeding commands to the controls, the TriStar carried three, running in parallel, constantly comparing notes. If one computer's answer disagreed with the other two, it was outvoted and quietly removed from the loop, the approach continuing uninterrupted, the disagreement resolved before a human ever needed to know it happened. The triple-channel automatic flight control system enabled fail-operational autoland, where three autopilot computers ran simultaneously and cross-monitored each other, so that a single disagreement could be voted out while the approach continued safely. The result, certified after Lockheed's test program flew over 500 autolands to prove the system out, was an airplane that pilots described almost with disbelief. You could brief an approach into weather that in any other aircraft would have meant diverting to another city, and instead of white-knuckling through minimums, you watched the runway lights simply appear out of the murk, exactly on schedule, exactly on centerline. There was a second innovation, quieter but almost as remarkable to the pilots who flew it.
Traditional aircraft control their descent rate on approach by adjusting pitch, raising or lowering the nose, which passengers feel as a faint but constant seesawing motion. The TriStar's direct lift control system did something different. Rather than adjusting pitch, it engaged spoiler panels on the wings directly, letting the aircraft fine-tune its descent and stay aligned with the glide slope while holding a remarkably stable pitch angle. Pilots who transitioned onto the TriStar from earlier jets consistently remarked on how different the final approach felt. Not the small hunting and correcting they were used to, but something closer to gliding down an invisible rail. Passengers noticed it too, even if they couldn't explain why. Cabin crews recall it as one of the smoothest approaches in the fleet, a landing so gentle that some passengers weren't sure the wheels had touched down until the reverse thrust announced it. It should have felt, to everyone aboard, like an unambiguous triumph. And for years, it was.
But something else was happening quietly in TriStar cockpits during those early years. Something harder to measure than glide slope accuracy or landing smoothness. If you're enjoying this documentary, consider subscribing. Every video here is carefully researched to bring you the real stories, remarkable aircraft, and pivotal moments that shaped aviation history. Now, let's continue. Pilots were learning, gradually, to trust the machine more completely than any generation of aviators before them. That trust didn't arrive instantly. Early TriStar crews, trained for decades on aircraft where every control input came from a human hand, treated the autopilot the way a new driver treats cruise control. Engaged but watched constantly, hands hovering near the controls, eyes locked on the instruments as if daring the system to fail. Flight engineers, whose entire job was monitoring systems the pilots in front couldn't see, described those early months as a kind of controlled skepticism, impressed by what the airplane could do, but not yet willing to look away from it. Confidence built the way it always does, through repetition. Approach after approach, in fog and rain and the deep black of moonless nights over open water. The system delivered exactly what it promised. And confidence, once earned, has a way of quietly reshaping behavior. The hovering hand relaxes. The constant cross-check becomes an occasional glance. Not through carelessness, through something more human and more forgivable. The system had, approach after approach, told every crew that flew it, "I have this." That, in the end, is what a great automated system is supposed to do. It is supposed to be trusted. Few people in those cockpits could have known that the very completeness of that trust, built approach after approach on a system that had never given them a reason to doubt it, was quietly becoming the thing to watch most closely. On the night of December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 was on its final approach into Miami, carrying 163 passengers and 13 crew home from New York. It was a routine flight on a routine airplane flown by an experienced crew who had made this same approach more times than any of them could count. As the landing gear came down, one indicator light, the one confirming the nose gear was locked, failed to illuminate. It was, on its own, a minor mechanical annoyance. Landing gear indicator lights burn out. It happens. But minor problems in a cockpit have a way of consuming attention disproportionate to their actual danger, and this one did exactly that. The captain elected not to land with an unconfirmed gear indication. He broke off the approach, climbed to a holding altitude of 2,000 feet, and engaged the autopilot to hold that altitude steady while the crew worked the problem. It was, by every account, the responsible decision. Upon engagement of the autopilot, all 3 crew members and an additional flight deck passenger began troubleshooting the landing gear indication problem, pulling the light assembly from its socket, sending the flight engineer down into the avionics bay beneath the cockpit to physically check, through a small porthole, whether the gear was actually down. It was.
But somewhere in that focused, reasonable, entirely human effort to solve a small problem, something else happened that nobody in the cockpit registered. The crash is believed to have been caused by a subtle bump of the yoke, which switched the autopilot from altitude hold mode into control wheel steering mode, a mode that would faithfully hold whatever pitch the aircraft happened to be in at that instant, rather than actively climbing back to the assigned altitude. The airplane began to descend. Nothing about it demanded attention. There was no alarm bell, no shudder, no dramatic pitch of the nose. The aircraft maintained level flight for the next 80 seconds, then dropped 100 feet, flew level again for 2 more minutes, and then began a descent so gradual it could not be perceived by the crew. 3 men who had, between them, decades of flying experience. Men who had trusted this airplane through hundreds of approaches in far worse conditions than this clear December night, were 12 feet from their instruments and did not see it happening, because every one of them was looking somewhere else, solving the problem that seemed, in that moment, to matter. As the crew turned back toward the airport, the first officer finally glanced at the altimeter and asked whether they had done something to their altitude. The captain's last recorded words were a question about what was happening. 3 seconds later, the aircraft struck the Everglades. 101 of the 176 people aboard did not survive that night. 75 did. A number of investigators would later attribute partly to the marshy ground absorbing some of the impact, and partly to the extraordinary work of rescuers who reached the crash site by airboat within the hour. It remains one of the most carefully studied accidents in aviation history, not because the cause was exotic, but because it was so unnervingly ordinary. The National Transportation Board's investigation determined the probable cause to be the flight crew's failure to monitor their instruments during the final minutes of flight, distracted by their preoccupation with the landing gear indicator problem, which allowed an unexpected descent to go unnoticed until it was too late to prevent. There was no equipment failure the way we usually picture one. The engines ran perfectly. The wings, the hydraulics, the extraordinary autoland system that could land this same airplane in conditions no human eye could penetrate, none of it malfunctioned in any conventional sense. The system did precisely what it was designed to do. It simply did it quietly enough, and everyone trusted it completely enough that nobody noticed the moment it stopped doing what everyone assumed it was still doing. The investigation into Flight 401 didn't just produce a probable cause. It produced a warning the entire industry would spend the next decade absorbing. Cockpit procedures changed permanently. Airlines began mandating that at least one crew member's full attention remain on flight instruments at all times, regardless of what else was happening in the cockpit. A rule that sounds almost obvious today, precisely because this crash is part of why it exists. The incident became one of the founding case studies in what aviation now calls crew resource management, the recognition that a cockpit's greatest vulnerability often isn't a single failed part, but the way skilled, well-intentioned people can lose track of the bigger picture while solving a smaller one directly in front of them. The TriStar's autopilot itself was refined further in the years that followed, with clearer mode indications and more assertive alerts when the system changed states on its own. The aircraft went on to become the first wide-body certified for the most demanding category of automatic landing then recognized by regulators. And TriStars continued flying long-haul and transatlantic routes for another 2 decades, trusted by the very airlines that had grieved Flight 401. That's the part of the story that resists easy narration. The TriStar wasn't a flawed airplane redeemed despite itself. It was, by nearly every engineering measure, one of the most capable aircraft ever built. And the tragedy it's remembered for wasn't the failure of its engineering. It was a preview of a problem that automation itself creates. The better a machine performs, the less its operators watch it. And the less they watch it, the more silently it can fail. That tension didn't end with the TriStar. It followed automation into every cockpit built after it, and eventually into cars, ships, and factories that now run on the same basic premise: a machine reliable enough to be trusted, operated by humans whose attention naturally drifts in proportion to that reliability. Modern aviation calls it automation complacency, and pilots today train specifically to guard against it, cross-checking systems not because they distrust them, but because they've learned from nights like this one exactly what unconditional trust can cost. That green autopilot light, glowing steadily as the aircraft settled into the Everglades, was never lying. The system was doing exactly what it had been told to do, exactly as reliably as it always had. It was the most advanced airliner of its era, built by engineers who had solved one of aviation's hardest problems: teaching a machine to land itself in conditions no human pilot could manage alone. The tragedy was never that the TriStar could fly itself too well. It was that flying itself well enough for long enough taught three trusting, capable people that they no longer needed to watch as closely as they once had. Every aircraft built since has carried that lesson forward in its design, whether its crews know the history behind it or not. And that, in the end, is the quiet legacy of the airplane that almost flew itself. Not a cautionary tale about a flawed machine, but an enduring reminder that the moment we finally trust something completely is the moment we most need to keep paying attention.